Are we live? All right, fantastic. I know the people online can't see this, but this is locally, you guys can see this. So I am about 3 weeks after the conference last year, I get an email from Paul Dose, the organizer of this conference. And the title of the email is Thoughts, ? In the body of the email it says, see attached JPEG. That's it. So I read this and I can't for the life of me figure out what the heck he's talking about. So I write Paul back and I say, Paul, could you explain this? Now, you have all heard Paul speak. So it is at no end of irony that Paul's emails are notoriously short, to the point of cryptic. There are no rabbit trails in Paul's emails. So I write Paul and I'm like, Paul, I have no idea what you want from me here. And so finally Paul writes me back and he says, is this hot? Is this a little too hot?
A little, yeah.
Can you turn me down just a touch? Check. Does that work?
That's much better.
That's a little better? Okay, good. All right, so he writes me back and he says, the idea, now mind you, with this in mind, this is Paul's response, the idea that freedom of man is a pipe dream because he is enslaved to his own desires spiritually. Hence, at the very least, indifference to political freedom on a social level. So, here's his question. So, will the new Calvinist movement cause political indifference in American society among Christians? And I'm like, oh, I get it. So then I go back to this, and for those of you online, you can't see this, but this guy, Mark Ray, I get to use the cool pointer now. Mark Ray, here, I don't know who he is, don't care, it doesn't matter. He says right here, it is ordained in the internal construction of things that men of intemperate minds cannot be free. Their passions forge their fetters. And this is when I finally understood what Paul's after. He's interested in me commenting on the impact of New Calvinism on American culture, what it is trying to do. Now, of course, this Mark Ray is actually quoting a guy by the name of Edmund Burke. You can look him up. He's not really an enigmatic character. But Edmund Burke held the fundamental assumption about human existence, and this quote, ultimately that the nature of man requires that man can only be governed by a totalitarian government, that the function of government is human restraint. So anyway, Paul is asking me to weigh in on this particular issue, and my response was, yes. I'll summarize. Yes. This is exactly what the Neo-Calvinist movement is going to do. Now, my email response to Paul was about 500 words. I gave a detailed explanation, and it turns out it is, well, I gave that explanation. I won't tell you what I said. And so then I send it off to Paul, and Paul says to me, this would be a perfect progression from this year to next year. This could be your 2014 thesis for next year's conference. So this is exactly what we're going to talk about. The Edmund Burke comment and its specific impact on the progression of American thought, where we are. Now, of course, the flyer says that I'm going to talk about National Socialist Germany. That is true. We are going to talk about that. But before I get too much farther into this, I actually guess I do need to make some introductions. My name is John Immel. I like to introduce myself this way. I am no one from nowhere. And the important thing about this is that there is a general trend and a general move within Christianity. The assumption being that if you're standing behind a pulpit, that you bear some form of authority, and that the expectation is that whatever I say, you have some obligation to accept. I reject that as a fundamental premise. I'm not here as a representative of authority. I am here to present to you ideas and the most powerful argument that I can bring to you. And you're part of this conversation, and it is a conversation, is for you to bring your highest and best rational self to this engagement. I'm going to make the most powerful argument I can. And I want you to engage your brain and to think and to analyze and to find out what is correct, what is true. And if I've done my job well, you will end up agreeing with me. Because I believe I hold right ideas. But here's how this works. If you can find a flaw in what I've said, then you have the ability to say, hey, John, now here I think is an adjustment. And if you make a powerful argument, if you make a good argument, and I apply my rational individuality to that, I go, you know what? That's true. Now, having said that, I did write a book. I wrote this book called Blight in the Vineyard, Exposing the Roots, Myths, and Emotional Torment of Spiritual Tyranny. You can buy this online, Amazon.com. It's $23.99 online. If you like what I say in the conference, those of you who are watching me online, if you like what I say, you're going to find more of the same in here. Now, I will say this. I wrote this, and I'll get into this just a little bit more here in a moment. I wrote this using a modern denomination called Sovereign Grace Ministries as my anecdote. But the book is not about Sovereign Grace Ministries specifically. The book is about how the ideas embedded in what we're going to talk about shaped this specific ministry. So I talk about a who, so we can talk about a what. And the what are the ideas that are behind it. And in particular, the neo-Calvinists, the new resurgent movement of Calvinism in the United States. Now, it is a little dated because when I wrote this, most of the major players, and those of you familiar within evangelical Christianity, certainly will have heard names like C.J. Mahaney, Brent Detweiler, Joshua Harris. These are all people at the top of the uber super apostles, whatever they want to call themselves now. There's been a split within that denomination, and so that current history is not reflected in the book, but it actually doesn't matter. Because the book is not about the personalities or the organization of that denomination. The book is about how the ideas were used to create this denomination, Sovereign Grace Ministries, and ultimately how that causes them to act within that denomination. So you'll still get the same things, even though, like I said, it's historically dated. So this conference, this specific conference, represents the culmination of about at least 20 years of thinking for me. And to give you a sense of scope, which is what I think I do best, I think I give people the framework best. I need to actually talk about me personally a little bit. I got born again when I was 15. So my exposure to Christianity is going on 30 years. Now, I got born again and became immediately a part of a Brethren church in Eaton, Ohio, actually not too far from where we are now. And my introduction to Christianity was dramatic. I'm confident there are people that can tell you about my life through my high school career. But I took Christianity seriously. I invested in Christianity. I invested in what I believed to be the truth with absolute commitment. So by the time I was 18, I was fully invested and fully committed to Christianity, modern American Christianity. Now I'm going to make a distinction here. modern American Christianity, Christianity in America, and we'll talk about this more later as a historical development. Christianity is in America, Christianity first had the opportunity to disagree, to fundamentally diverge from the historic Calvinist roots. And starting in the early 19th century, in the United States, a unique brand of Christianity showed up, and that was the Pentecostal movement. And the Pentecostal movement was a renewal movement, a return to the gifts of the Spirit, speaking in tongues, healing, and a very immediate, very specifically present kind of Christianity. And it was rooted in, and it had some of its intellectual roots in the Wesleyan movement. And they rejected determinism, they rejected predestination, and they believed in free will. Now, when I say charismatic and I say Pentecostal, unfortunately, there are some profound limitations to those definitions. Because there really is no formal definition of Pentecostal and no formal definition of charismatic. I can tell you what they tend to emphasize. Well, all renewal movements are necessarily movements of personality. Most of the early revival movements in the United States came from men with specific messages. John Alexander Dowie, John G. Lake, William J. Seymour. If you have any interest at all in learning the evolution of charismatic / Pentecostal movements, these names are going to be at the top of the list. Now, by the time we hit, fast forward probably about 40 years, we're now in the middle of a resurgent charismatic movement called the Charismatic Renewal. And it was Pentecostalism all grown up. And one of the primary and leading figures of that time frame would be men like Oral Roberts. One of the first men in the history of the world to impact the globe by mass media. Now, when I came into Christianity, this is around 1981, 82. The charismatic renewal was still unformed. There weren't really mega churches as you and I know mega churches. We were still back then arguing whether or not you could have guitars in church, whether you could have drums in church. Now, today, if you don't have contemporary music and guitars and drums, nobody shows up. But back then, people were going to war over whether or not you should have a guitar and an amplifier. To give you some sense of proportion of how far we've come. Now, mind you, by the time I'm 19 years old, I end up going, for a series of reasons, to Oral Roberts University, thinking that I would arrive at, say, charismatic utopia. People that believe with me. Most of my young life, I took, the idea of taking the gospel to the streets very seriously. And so I was very much on the front line. And the nature of social hostility, I had experienced that. So I was tired. And so I was looking for a place where I could fit in and blend in. Now, unfortunately, my personality and who I am pretty much eliminates that as an option. So I get to Oral Roberts University, and my love is, of course, ideas. And so I find myself terribly attracted to studying theology. My degree is in systematic and historical theology with a minor in Old Testament. What that basically means is that the sum of my education, my bachelor's degree, was in church history, the progression of church doctrine, and systematic theology. Now, the funny thing about Oral Roberts University was this. I get there thinking that I would necessarily fit in, and that many of the doctrines that I had grown up learning and investing in, that they would be reflected in the School of Theology. You have Oral Roberts as the icon, the School of Theology then therefore, and mind you, this is not Bible school. This is a real, genuine, committed School of Theology. Well, haha on me. I get into the Department of Theology, and the department head at the time was Siegfried Schatzman. And Siegfried Schatzman was a Calvinist, a committed Calvinist from Europe. I think he was from, not Germany, the country that stays perpetually neutral. Switzerland. I think he was from Switzerland. I can be wrong, but I think that's where he's from. So he's a committed Calvinist. Now, mind you, most people make this fundamental mistake. They assume that Calvinism is somehow negotiable, that we can somehow pick and choose which parts of Calvinism we want. And so then they try to hybridize a lot of these ideas. And in particular, when confronted with the charismatic movement, the doctrines that are most consistently ascribed to that renewal, people tend to think, well, we can kind of pull them in, but this is really the true core of the gospel. And if we can figure out how to somehow successfully integrate it all, then everything will be fine. This is false. It's not possible, and it does not work, and we're going to eventually figure out why. And on many levels, Dr. Schatzman was a super nice guy, but he was a committed Calvinist, and he organized the Department of Theology around that body of idea. And he knew he had an entire student body committed, for the most part, to the Pentecostal charismatic concepts. So he was patient, but at the end of the day, in his mind, real theology was rooted in Calvinism. Now, herein is the implicit conflict. You would go to chapel Tuesdays and Thursdays, and the charismatic speaker of the day would blow through and say whatever they had to say, and the theology department, who sat physically, if you can imagine this, in the Mabee Center, would sit up here, and I could physically see them, and without fail, they were universally outraged at whatever was said up front. And I will never forget the day, I think it was the leader of music, stands up in front, and he's leading worship for the student body, and he stops, and he says, now everybody clap, because when we clap, we summon angels. I can see by some of your looks, you're like, what? Exactly. That was the kind of doctrinal output that very often came from the front. Now, I'm not saying that it was universally bad. I'm just saying that you could hear things like this. And the theology department would react mightily. So I was dead square in the middle of the ongoing fight, the power and the effectiveness of charismatic style doctrines, and the critique of pure, well, effectively the only form of academic theology that is it for Protestantism. So now I'm going to fast forward through about a decade. Of course, I graduated, and I have no home. Charismatic churches don't have any interest in what I've learned or what I know. But by the same token, I had spent an entire college career addressing the fundamental problems that I saw with Calvinism as such. Combating those arguments, being aware of those arguments, writing endless papers on those arguments, defending those papers against myself and the entire classroom. So I am no stranger to the fight. By the time I get to Washington, D.C. area, specifically Gaithersburg, Maryland, I am now 26 years old. And I land on the doorstep of a then People of Destiny International. Now, for those of you who don't know, People of Destiny International eventually becomes Sovereign Grace Ministries. But this is still them in their sort of infancy. They have become sort of a national player, but they have not made the dramatic move from where they were as a generally charismatic-ish church. They believed in speaking in tongues, laying hands on the sick. Now, granted, there was very qualified doctrine from their church, but they still practiced it on some level. Long about 1991, they started to make a transition into what I knew was Calvinism. And I had fundamental objections to Calvinism from that point. Now, of course, they look at me. Well, let me say this first. When I first got there, they presented themselves as these very broad-minded, interested in ideas, thinkers, social commentators. And I thought, frankly, I thought I'd found home. pardon me, I was eventually to learn that was totally false. They had no interest in ideas, and they had no interest in anybody else's input. I made the faulty assumption that I could object, that this was a reasonable action on my part, on anybody's part, if they saw a problem with the doctrine. They should be able to say, no, that's not true. This, of course, embroiled me in all manner of church conflict, to the point that they eventually told me I was deleterious. And, oh, by the way, why don't you go out and start your own church? Which it has never ceased to amaze me, the irony. By the way, you're deleterious, which means, if you don't know, evil, wicked, pernicious, and destructive. You're deleterious. But by all means, go out and start your own church. To this day, I think that's hilarious. Yes, by the way, we can't control you, but would you really go out there and wreck everybody else's life? So I am confronted with these ideas, and trust me, I was a half an inch, and even knowing what I know, I was a half an inch from making the jump. I was a half an inch from making the jump and committing myself to Calvinism as such. Now, that didn't obviously happen, and it took me a long time to unravel the problems. But because of the way I tend to approach the world, I saw commonalities. Now, of course, the original criticism was, well, the reason there's a conflict, John, is because you're here. The conflict is you. Okay, and in as much as you accept some of their assumptions, then that makes abundant sense. But remember, by the time I land on their door, I've got almost a decade of Christian life behind me. I already have an identity that spanned a number of different denominations, a number of different church flavors, plus the intention to create theology as a professional pursuit. So the standard denunciations and the standard objections to me didn't work. I did not quickly embrace the notion that I could be so fundamentally wrong. But this ultimately set me on the path of identifying what is the commonality here. Because here was what I noticed. I had already seen these doctrines in some form and in some fashion, even in the charismatic churches. I get out of Sovereign Grace Ministries and I go participate in other churches, and I still see the same themes, the same ideas. And trust me, I was one of the few people going around when this is back in the 90s, actually objecting to the broader actions of Sovereign Grace Ministries. I was absolutely a lone voice. So any preacher I ever heard that ever said to me, or ever preached from the pulpit, it is my job, your job is to submit to me. It is my job to defend the sheep. If I heard that, I specifically went to them and I asked them to get involved in protecting the sheep in context to the conduct of this ministry. Universally, they said no. We got a technical glitch here? We good? Yep. So I see these themes creeping up consistently, and fundamental to them was the doctrine of submission and authority, the presumption that select men had the moral right to dictate to me intellectual conclusion. And that concurrent with that submission, that they were somehow uniquely qualified to understand the truth, and nobody else really was. And that by virtue of that authority, that they had the right to treat me however they chose. I didn't care about however they qualified that justification, at the root, that's what they presumed. And if I was not willing to embrace what they said, it was a moral failing on my part. And the presumption is that the moral failing began with me. And for a while, of course, I accepted the presumption that the problem was me. But then I realized, wait a minute, this stuff exists whether I'm at the church or not. There's only one other common denominator, and that is the doctrine. Well, I had enough historical background. My degree made it possible for me to understand the evolution of Christian thought effectively from the 1st century to about the 18th century. And I had enough church history background to understand that this was actually not uncommon. once I identified those fundamental elements, I realized this has happened before, and it's happened over and over and over. And so I said to myself, I finally had to ask myself, how is it possible that the church finds itself in bed with tyrants or abetting tyrants or as tyrants itself? And let me catch up on the slides here. So I decided, and that's when I came up with this. I've shown this in pretty much every conference we've got. This is the gospel according to John Immel, and I identified this consistency. All people act logically from their assumptions. It does not matter how inconsistent the ideas or insane the rationale, they will act until the logic is fulfilled. Therefore, when you see masses of people taking the same destructive actions, find the assumptions and you will find the cause. Why is the church so consistently found aiding and abetting tyranny? When you see masses of people taking the same destructive actions, find the assumptions and you will find the cause. I wasn't the only person that had ever made this observation. Now, of course, when I formulated this, I had read James Madison's. James Madison actually said this in the Moral and Remonstrance Against Religious Assessments. James Madison, point 7, because experience witnesses that ecclesiastical establishments, instead of maintaining the purity and efficacy of religion, have had a contrary operation. During almost 15 centuries, has the legal establishment of Christianity been on trial? What have been its fruits? More or less in all places. Pride and indolence in the clergy, ignorance and servility in the laity. In both superstition, bigotry, and persecution. Point 8, because what influence, in fact, have ecclesiastical establishments had on civil society? In some instances, they have been seen to erect a spiritual tyranny on the ruins of civil authority. In many instances, they have been seen upholding the thrones of political tyranny. In no instance have they been seen as guardians of the liberties of the people. And James Madison nailed it. The bulk of Christian history is one long, slow-motion train wreck of tyranny. This bothered me viscerally. This is a problem. If we ultimately genuinely believe that God is love, and yet with stunning consistency, the church that he is supposed to call his own ends up at the forefront of tyranny, there is something seriously wrong with this picture. Of course, like I said, we are going to talk about National Socialist Germany. But for me to do that, I need to reclaim being able to talk about Nazism. For the most part, the moment you say Nazi, it is tended to believe, people tend to assume that it's pejorative, and that you're describing someone who is a jackbooted thug, and the tantamount assertion is that you just want to start sticking people in ovens and killing them. So on some level, I understand why the discussion of Nazis has become taboo. People who don't know what they're talking about tend to toss around the accusation without any real association or attachment to reality. But this is actually not, this doesn't really explain why the discussion of Nazis is so taboo. And I have a conspiracy theory. And I'm going to tell you my conspiracy theory because I think it bears directly on what we're going to ultimately talk about. I am stunned at the veto power people believe they have when we discuss Nazis. How quickly they are to dismiss the discussion. The National Socialist Germany is an instructional morality event of epic proportions. Let me put it to you this way. If I say to you, if I start talking about Joseph Stalin or Lenin, and I talk to you about the things that they did, the fact that they turned Soviet Russia into a bloodbath, the fact that Joseph Stalin created a government-created famine to wipe out a third of his population. If I talk to you about the fact that they had concentration camps, and that they did all these evil things, for the most part, people shrug and go, okay, maybe that's true. And at the end of the day, if they actually want to really carry any discussion on it at all, particularly from a Christian perspective, they go, well, of course that's what happened. It was a bunch of atheists, and you know that if you abandon God, then you don't have any foundation for morality, and if you don't have any foundation for morality, you get to act whatever you want. You know, a bunch of atheists, secular humanism, all those bad things. And people go, it's not such a big deal. But the moment I say Nazi, there's a visceral reaction and a visceral rejection of any objective observation of what happened. I find this curious because in each instance, they actually produce the exact same outcomes. The Nazis did exterminate 7 million Jews, but they also exterminated 7 million other people. The body count in Germany was 14 million people. And communists were leading among them. Men who held ideology, not race. And here's why I think this is. And here's why I think being able to reclaim this, resisting the veto, the stigma. Two things. Germany in the 1920s was Christian by any definition. Not only was it Christian, it was Lutheran Christian by any definition. Of the 60 million people that resided in Germany, 40 million identified themselves as evangelicals. For the most part, evangelical Germany is effectively the same as evangelical America. The doctrinal distinctions, the doctrinal deviations are so minor as to be ultimately irrelevant. The other 20 million identified themselves as Catholic or some variation of Protestantism, with only about 1% embodying a genuinely non-Christian mysticism. You understand? And the second thing is that I don't think people want to notice that National Socialism was about socialism. And I think this is actually the biggest problem. Most people tend to believe that socialism is a kinder, gentler version of economic organization. And if they can keep you away from noticing too closely that it was socialism was the underlying goal, the final solution, the destruction of undesirables, that's the leaf on the very end of the social tree. But the underlying premise was always that it is the state's job and the state's responsibility. It was the state's moral obligation to take productive work and redistribute it for the masses. This is a prevailing assumption that we are actually seeing emerging in the United States. And the thing that I think that people want to prevent is people noticing the relationship between socialism and the ultimate action that came next in National Socialist Germany. Of course, I firmly reject the notion that people have the right to veto this conversation. It doesn't make me a nut. All I'm doing is making an observation of the content of history. Of course, there is a common objection that the reason the evil in Germany took place is because a select few did bad things. and that good men did nothing. The only thing necessary for evil to triumph is for good men to do nothing. Does this explain what happened in National Socialist Germany? I'm going to let you ponder that question. Before we can genuinely answer that question, we need to do some serious remedial work. We need to understand what shaped Germany in the 1920s. And the reason we need to understand history is because, as Adolf Hitler once said, a man who has no sense of history is a man who has no ears or eyes. Now, for me to do my job, I'm going to have to introduce you to philosophy. I see some new faces. You guys, some of you have seen this before, but I need new ideas, fresh ideas, different ideas need to be repeated and repeated until people grasp the implication. Of course, in Christianity, the moment somebody says philosophy, their minds immediately jump to Paul, talking about vain philosophies, and they go, boop, punt, and this conversation is over. Well, there are vain philosophies. There are philosophies that the nature of their formulation is vanity. That is true. But the concept of philosophy, the study of philosophy, is the integration of ideas. I need to get my cat pointer here. Hang on. Philosophy is comprised of these 5 disciplines. The first one is metaphysics. The second one is epistemology. The third is ethics. Fourth is politics. And the last one is aesthetics. Here's an explanation of what this means. The nature of existence is metaphysics. How man knows what he knows is called epistemology. How we value what we know is ethics. How we interact with people is politics. And how man creatively reflects his existence back to himself is called aesthetics or art. Now here's the thing. Man cannot help but integrate his ideas. It's the way he's built. From the time you're this big, the first thing you want to understand is how it fits together. He must organize his ideas into a cohesive system, exactly like a fish must breathe in water. For man, his ideas do not hang in a vacuum. His ideas must be attached to something. And he must start from the most rudimentary part of his existence. He must start at the beginning. It is a hard thing to learn to think in essentials, to think in principles, and to think in terms of ideological relationships. It is hard to learn to think philosophically. However, most people are unaware of this big picture. Most people don't think in these terms. But they are constantly treating their ideas as if. Most people take ideas kind of like a smorgasbord. Oh, I like this one, and I like this one, I don't like that one, I like this one, and they put it all in the basket, they nibble on it, that's pretty good, that's pretty good. And they treat the ideas very carelessly. And yet, they will often find themselves dead square in the middle of some form of conflict, some form of psychic pain. And because they treat ideas carelessly, they don't recognize that the psychic pain that they hold is directly tied to mutually exclusive ideas, mutually exclusive values that are in conflict. And this is because they have not done a successful job at integrating, eliminating the errors from the most rudimentary level of their ideas to the practical outworking. And the result is uncertainty. Susan made a fantastic point in her presentation, and she was talking about the woman who could not reconcile whether she was going to heaven or not. She is experiencing an enormous amount of psychic pain, because in her mind, was she damned or was she elect? She could not reconcile the question, because by doctrine she cannot reconcile that question, unless she does what? She commits an act of atrocity that she knows in her mind, at least by doctrinal construct, can never be solved, can never be fixed. But notice, she could not handle the intellectual chaos. She could not handle in her own head that she couldn't resolve this fundamental problem. Her metaphysical existence, the very nature of her fundamental existence, she needed that resolved. And that drove her to kill her own baby. This is indicative of the very need that man has to solve this problem in his own mind. It is this kind of power that philosophy really has over the minds of men. It is the nature of who we are. Did I bring that or not? I did not. I have another Gospel according to John Immel quote. Since I'm quoting myself, it seems obvious that it seems ironic that I can't think of the actual reference. Man abhors chaos like nature abhors a vacuum. Man cannot abide intellectual chaos. He must order the nature of his world. And the anecdote that Susan identified, the reason people went insane, the reason there was so much psychic pain in the Puritan world is because the nature of the ideas, the full philosophical statements that is Calvinism, drove them to ideological chaos. Man cannot tolerate this, hence the quest for an integration of ideas is what has dominated the whole of human history. Pardon me. So philosophy is the process of learning to think in integration, learning to think in putting things, ideas together, learning to see essentials, learning to think in principles, learning to be aware of how you integrate your ideas. Don't treat ideas carelessly. Learn to identify, wait a minute, if I believe this and I believe this, you realize those don't go together. There is a conflict. And the moment you experience psychic pain, one of the first things man tends to do is to go, oops, I don't like that reality, poof, and he punts the inconsistency into the abyss. Man's greatest vice is his determination to look at reality and go, you know what, I don't care. To wipe the reality out of existence. To take what is and just go, you know what, I don't like that. In a recent blog conversation, a man advocating the power of the Matthew 18 ethic finds himself in the middle of a fight he doesn't like against someone's argument he cannot handle. And his response was to go, you're dead to me. To solve his intellectual problem, what did he do? He wiped that man out of existence. This is man's greatest vice. I will introduce one rabbit trail. If you read the first chapter of Romans, it is man's determination to look at reality and wipe out its causal relationship that sends him into depravity. Rabbit trail, I'll let you chew on that. Since it is the subject of this conversation, we are already familiar with how this actually breaks out with Augustine, with Calvinistic thought. Now, you're going to hear this relentlessly. When I say Augustine, I mean Calvin. When I say Calvin, I mean Augustine. They are absolutely connected. And there is no reasonable man with any rational integrity that would like to make a case otherwise. I don't really understand how it can be any more blunt. Doctrinally, there is fundamentally no distinction between Augustinian doctrine, Lutheran doctrine, and Calvinist doctrine. So, Augustine says, what of man's basic metaphysic? Man is corrupt. Man is metaphysically corrupt. He is corrupt from the nature of his existence. He has no redeeming good quality in his existence. Anytime you think you got something good, you don't. Because man is corrupt, metaphysically corrupt, that means epistemologically, he can't know anything. Because man can't physically know anything, his moral responsibility, his ethical responsibility is his own self-destruction. And because man cannot do good, in other words, he will not follow through on his ethical standard, he necessarily needs a government that will compel him to that action. So if you won't sacrifice you, there will be a government that will sacrifice you. And last, of course, is aesthetics. Aesthetics, we're not going to touch a lot of it, but I'm going to make a couple of references. This is how man reflects the world back to himself. Let me see if I can figure out how to say this quickly. Man needs a means by which he refuels his existence. And he needs a means by which how he takes his most rudimentary assumptions about his life and he puts that into a form that when he looks back at it, he is refreshed. This is the roots of aesthetics. However, if you presume man's metaphysical corruption, and you presume all of these fundamental things that Augustine presumes, what kind of art do you create? You create churches lined with gargoyles. You create Dante's Inferno, where the nature of your art specifically reflects man's catastrophe, destruction, impotence, fear, terror. All of that is, all that anxiety, all that neuroses, all that psychoses is what is reflected back. So your art will always follow your most rudimentary philosophical assumptions. Now, I want to introduce this. You need to understand these elements to understand what I'm going to talk about. The dominant philosophy on the planet is collectivism. It is the presumption that man is first and foremost the property of the state. The property of the state, the property of society, the property of tribe, the property of community, or denomination, or local church, or sect. Man's first and primary specific social organization is the property of all of these entities, and you can see my chart. Ultimately, we're talking about collectivism. It all falls in here. You understand? Yes, no, shake your head. Okay.
Hold on a minute.
Okay, yes.
In fact, back up about 30 seconds.
Okay. We good? For those of you who can't hear, I've been asked to back up about 30 seconds. Paul, go.
Yeah, he's got to dump. You're going to have to dump the internal memory to the SIMS card.
Are we not recording? Is that what's happening?
It just shut off on us.
Okay.
Because the internal memory is full, so he's going to have to dump the internal memory to the SIMS card. And that's going to take about 2 minutes.
Okay, very good.
Yeah. Is that full? Is it dumping? Okay, cool.
Now we play the waiting game.
Okay.
Once you dump that, we'll be good for 3 or 4 hours. We'll just have to keep an eye on it. Basically, when I do the editing, and that's why we're doing the backup with the recorder. If we have a loss like that, I can put the voice recording with that frame, and it's all the same.
Okay.
You're not being seen anyway, so.
John, while we have a little interlude here, you were mentioning aesthetics with regards to philosophy, and you said you weren't going to spend much time with that.
Correct.
In light of this conversation regarding collectivism and socialism, I was reminded of something that had struck me some time ago, and it was someone published an article with 45 agendas, 45 goals of communism, and I believe it was taken right from the Communist Manifesto. Number 22, number 23 are particular pertinence to this regarding aesthetics. Number 22 was continue discrediting American culture by degrading all forms of artistic expression. An American communist cell was told to eliminate all good sculptures from parks and buildings, substitute shapeless, awkward, and meaningless forms. Number 23 says, control art critics and directors of art museums. Our plan is to promote ugliness, repulsiveness, and meaningless art.
What are you reading from? Sorry.
The 45 goals of communism.
Are we
According
still live online by chance?
From the Communist Manifesto.
From the Communist Manifesto.
So they make no bones about it.
No.
Well, and the thing that I want you to key in on there is that they are specifically trying to reflect back a reality of America that is necessarily destructive. It is necessarily disjointed. It is necessarily disintegrated. And the reason they want to do that is because when man goes to refresh himself and he sees this kind of art, what he is seeing is a reflection of a corruption. It's intentional. And art is just as much an expression of philosophy as any of these other three. Because it is how man goes about reinforcing the nature of who he thinks he is. And this is why what you just said is so on point. And you're going to see this repeatedly. Notice that what he read, can you reread that portion about it being ugly and disjointed?
And actually, I take this, but this was actually recorded. This is a current list of communist goals written in 1958, read into the Congressional Record in 1963.
Okay.
So this is from the Communist Party.
From the Communist Party, that's fine.
Of the 45, number 22 was continue discrediting American culture by degrading all forms of artistic expression. An American communist cell was told to eliminate all good sculpture from parks and buildings, substitute shapeless, awkward, and meaningless forms.
Hold that. Notice, substitute shapeless, awkward, and meaningless. When you look at a body of art that is deliberately shapeless, awkward, and meaningless, you're actually ingesting, you're internalizing a specific view of reality. And it is designed to create, in this instance, it is designed to create a dissatisfaction with American culture. That's its function. But you will see this theme throughout all ages. You will see the dominant philosophy ultimately reflected in its local art. That's actually a great point. I'm glad you brought that up. Because I do want people to understand how much these, remember, we're talking about integration here. You can't help but do this. You must take ideas and you must bring them together. Are we back up and live yet? We're recording? We're live, but we're not recording. Shoot, I wish I was on the tape because that's pretty good.
But it's about a fourth of the way done.
That's unfortunate because I was really within about 10 minutes of being done. Well, done with this session.
Should we sing a song?
Well, I'm going to hit the little voice ring. So
was gonna say, make sure you turn that off.
I'm talking to on the screen. I thought it was gonna take 20 minutes to get done.
Well, it has yours
Oh, it's
and
got it
Paul's,
done.
and I think
Oh,
some
it's got it
other
done.
one was on there. I thought it had an SD card in there. That wasn't just built-in memory. It's not raining yet, but it's
On this one.
Don't calm down, Mike.
I like the Thunderbird.
Yeah, we just went
Maybe
to
the
the
power blew out.
Cincinnati Art Museum. We had been there for 30 years. I don't need to go back for another 30, but we saw all that horrible art. I mean, just, we were just laughing, saying, well, our 5-year-old could do better than that. Grandchildren.
Battery.
We never thought of
Oh, you can report on battery.
It's again, it's the joy of how this philosophy, it internalize the ugliness, that you are ugly, you are spiritually
And I think those are
putrid, all of that. This is what, if you look in the actual Puritan writings of some of the devotional prayers written in preparations that the Puritans were getting for membership, they had to convince the church of an actual conversion experience by narratively showing how vile, ugly, putrid that they were before God.
That was the conversion.
Well, then, once they realized that, conversion was some mystical experience.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that's what's
It's
my
pouring down rain out
It
there.
is torn down.
Yeah.
Oh, that's interesting.
And this goes to that, the total depravity. Now, we are sinners. Before we were saved, we were sinners. Now we was righteous. But there's nowhere in Scripture that talks about total depravity. God said, evil people can still do good things. Not to gain salvation. I better walk.
I was gonna go outside and get warm. No.
You still can, it's still pretty warm out there.
Yeah, I bet it
Like,
is.
get other things.
Wow.
Yeah, because it has yours, mom's, as much as we got on his, and I think there was some other one on there.
And it's recorded in high definition. So,
We should take the time between sessions to
yeah.
transfer them.
Well, I forgot the Suns cards. And
That's me. Thank you for that, that comment about the art, because we just went to the Cincinnati Art Museum, and we're noticing, you know, the art like the 60s and 70s is totally meaningless.
Well, it gets better. I mean,
They did.
he comments on each one of these. He says our plan is to promote ugliness, repulsive, meaningless art. And he says, and for example, Jesus on the cross in urine, Mary surrounded by multiple buttocks with elephant dung, all praised as art.
You know, one thing, you said meaningless, we saw one art project where somebody just went all over the city collecting pennies.
Mhm.
And that was their art project. They had millions of pennies on the floor, and that was art. That's pretty meaningless.
Here's a good one. Break down cultural standards of morality by promoting pornography and obscenity in books, magazines, motion pictures, radio, and TV.
Oh, we got that.
Eliminate all laws governing obscenity by calling them censorship and a violation of free speech and free press. These are 45 goals of the
What
communist
size is
agenda
that
in the United
car?
States.
Destroy our nation, I guess.
The blue one?
That's why.
Have they accomplished all of them?
They've got.
No, there's
you'd be
only
sur-
one
You
black
read through these, you'd be surprised at how many are
Blue
currently
one.
part of our culture.
But it is 16 gigs, right?
Here's what I'm saying.
But that's the end game.
You will spend
I was just saying. Whether he uses the communists or some other group.
We'll spend more and more money. Just, you can, if you want to handle this 16 and 32 gig, and it's this, and then one more another gig. Now, what we can do,
Well, Andy?
Paul, listen to this one. Infiltrate churches and replace revealed religion with social religion.
Oh,
Discredit the Bible and emphasize the need for intellectual maturity, which does not need a religious crutch.
Right.
This is 1958.
Yeah.
because most modern.
Well, Andy, this answers the question of why we have so many laptops.
You have backups for your backups.
Yeah, we're going to have to continue.
You should have been responsible for keeping track of all those IRS emails. You probably wouldn't have lost them then.
Yeah.
Yeah, really, truly, it's all of my game machines, whole machines, my patent memory, and my machines. Because there's no reason to buy mine, there's no reason to invest in it. Most, there isn't anything on the shelf. Whatever, $100 version of GeForce. There's Botox, Bion, or something like that. You can't really go on with GeForce. If you want to, if you can spend $100, it's wait until the.
Okay, Philly. Here's what we're going to do, okay? This is going to take forever.
Yeah.
So basically what we're going to do,
Run off of the webcam.
yeah, we're going to run off of this webcam right here on set at high definition. Since this laptop is not live streaming. So, in fact, it's recording now, so we can continue on.
Check, check, check.
Yeah, that sounded really good, John.
Was it fantastic? I'm glad this mic's working well. I find this thing on my ear a little awkward, but hey. It's a pretty good investment. All right, I'm supposed to back up 30 seconds. I actually don't know where 30 seconds was.
It was your
The
initial
circle.
I was just
explanation of
showing you this stuff. Right? What was that?
Your initial explanation of the circle.
Circle of life.
Circle.
Okay. Gotta find the rhythm again. Okay, here we go. Now, the doctrines that we're going to talk about. The fundamental assumption of human existence, and you know what? That is awkward. That didn't work. Let's try that. That probably doesn't look so dorky, right?
Yeah.
I'm okay? All right. the almost universal assumption about the nature of man's existence is that man is the property of the state. Now, I know I have statism up there. I'm using this as a generalization. I got to use my QCAP pointer again. We have collectivism is the biggest box. Everything else is a reflection of this. So we have collectivism, statism, which is the political organization of a given geographical political organization, society or the tribe or the community or denomination or sect or little church. The presumption is that man is by design a part of this. All right? Now, this I introduced last year. If I may be so bold, this is my contribution to philosophy. I've never seen this anyplace else. I think this is a John Immel original. I have identified 5 categories of arguments that you will see in all forms of tyranny. I don't care the ideological pedigree. Ultimately, all arguments, I sound hot to me. Am I
No,
screeching?
you sound good.
Okay, good. All arguments, and there's a specific reason that I actually put this in the spider web. I wanted you to see that these are connected. These are not static boxes to put stuff in. You will see these arguments consistently with dynamic tension throughout. And here they are. And they start with, in as much as they start anywhere, with the idea of incompetent masses. Man is fundamentally metaphysically incompetent. And because he is metaphysically incompetent, he is universally guilty. In the Augustinian construct, this is the foundation of Augustine's construct. Man is metaphysically a sinner, metaphysically morally reprobate. He is universally guilty. He can never escape his guilt. It doesn't matter what action he takes. And because man is this and this, it requires that he has a government that dictates good. Once we get to the government stage, the government organizes everything around. The government must first abolish ambition. And what I mean by this is the government must first abolish individual initiative. Man can possess no individual self-motivation. The self must die. And once it succeeds in abolishing abolition, its specific goal is collective conformity. You will remember this here. This right here. This is the goal. Oops. The goal is utopian prestige. In every collectivist ideology, you will ultimately see the proclaimed ideal is some utopian ideal, whether it's the Marxist workers' paradise, whether it's the Gaia, the utopia of Earth, nature rule, nature worship, whether it be heaven,
Racial purity.
racial purity. It's always some utopian ideal that has no material expression. In other words, you'll never see it here. Now, I want to go back to, I have one more point that I'm going to make. Oops. Now, remember I asked you the question. For evil to triumph, the only thing necessary is for good men to do nothing. This is where most people encounter a philosophical system, ethics. For those of you watching me online, I'm pointing to ethics.
Actually, you can see the chart pretty good.
Can you?
Okay.
Okay, good. Most people have very little exposure to formal metaphysical statements or formal epistemological statements. What they will very consistently do is quote ethical expectations, and they don't realize that they're actually admitting and committing to an ethical formulation that is part of a bigger picture. When have you heard people say something like, he's selfish, he should sacrifice? How many people have heard that? How many people have said that? Those words, the expectation that it was moral, that selfishness was specifically immoral, and that the nature of sacrifice is specifically moral, that is actually reflective of a much bigger philosophical statement that we are going to eventually talk about. Usually, a culture's social values are expressions of ethics here. What we find offensive, what we get offended by in public, is specifically a reflection of our ethical values. And those ethical values are ultimately reflected in all of the entire progression here. You understand? People don't know where these ethical formulations come from, which means they don't really think about what they mean. But when you hear such comments throughout a culture, they are reflecting a full integration of a root philosophy. Now, ethics is where man experiences a political or philosophical formulation. Remember the question I've asked you, because this is going to be the theme we're going to hammer on throughout the entire my however many sessions I've got. I asked you the question. The only thing necessary for evil to triumph is for good men to do nothing. Ponder that question in light of that right there. Right? That's the first question.